So now we'll move on to Ariadne Schulz. Dr. Schulz is a paleopathologist educated at Durham, UK, and she wanted me to point out that her PhD is in paleopathology specifically. She currently lives in London, where she worked as an assistant curator in the British Museum and is now currently working as an archaeologist with Museum of London Archaeology. In her spare time, she volunteers with Democrats Abroad and Vote From Abroad to increase voter turnout, voting rights, and political literacy for United States citizens. Her hobbies include archery, opera, and video games. And today she's going to talk to us about politics and plague, disease, democracy, and Athens. So take it away, Dr. Schulz. I believe you're muted.
So I was. Can you hear me now?
I can, yeah.
Great.
And I'll let you get your presentation started. I'll tell you that it all comes up correctly.
Okay. Can you see my presentation now?
I can, yeah. I see the PowerPoint view.
Okay, let's just click into there.
Looks good.
Okay, right. I'm just going to move the Zoom so I can actually see what I'm reading. Okay, the last few talks have set me up remarkably well. I couldn't have hoped for anything better. Again, I am a paleopathologist, so I'm very new to this, and please be gentle when evaluating me. So the Athenian Plague is a historical event integrally interlaced with the political realities of the time. It proliferated as a result of tactical and political decisions of the time, and it also affected these decisions. It is impossible to draw direct correlations between other historical plagues and political events, or even our modern pandemic, but it would also be wrong to entirely dismiss the reality of how pathogens and our reaction to them form our history and culture, and how they inform our behavior. What became the Peloponnesian War was in fact the Second Peloponnesian War and grew essentially out of a conflict between Athens and its colonial holdings. In fact, throughout the war, Thucydides relates to negotiations between Athenian diplomats and either past or prospective tributary states. Athens controlled the sea and arguably therefore the economy in the mid-5th century BCE. Athens put down a revolt in Samos, but just prior, Sparta had called a congress to discuss whether or not the Peloponnesian League would aid Samos. Corinth notably opposed. However, when Corinth attempted to put down a revolt in their own colony, Corcia allied with Athens. Athens then ordered Potidaea, a tributary state of their own, to dismiss their Corinthian magistrates. This resulted in the Battle of Potidaea and, in conjunction with a sanction on Megara, led to the Spartans calling a congress on whether or not to go to war with Athens. The argument, hotly contested by the Athenian contingent, was that Athens had already broken the peace and would only press its naval and economic advantages further if left unchecked. When it became clear that the Peloponnesian War would advance on Attica, the Athenians who lived in the countryside withdrew within the walls of the city. Athens was already an incredibly populous city for the time, but when the refugees from the countryside began residing within the long walls of the city, the population ballooned and may have been as high as 300,000 or 400,000. Given the available knowledge of the time and taking into account supply routes, Pericles, the then strategos or governor of Athens, was content with a conservative defensive strategy. Athens food supplies could be replenished by sea, and he knew that the Delian League was a primarily naval power and unlikely to match the Spartans on land. Prior to the Peloponnesian War, Pericles had increasingly introduced policies unfriendly to immigrants and what we would today consider dual citizens. These policies restricted citizenship to those born in Athens, restricted metic or non-citizen rights, and made it difficult for metics to safely or effectively apply for Athenian citizenship. Moreover, the attitude towards non-citizens, including women, increasingly soured over the course of the war and the plague. Estimates suggest that the plague may have killed 1 to 2/3 of the total population. Victims of the plague included Pericles and his entire family, and the plague damaged Athens' ability to, in the immediate and subsequent years of the war, supply their hoplites. All told, the Peloponnesian War lasted nearly 30 years. There was a brief 6-year peace from 421 to 415 BCE, known as the Peace of Nicias, but Thucydides dismisses it as hostilities were never fully suspended. Athens finally surrendered in 404 BCE, and the democracy was temporarily replaced by the 30 tyrants. In the following unrest, Socrates was executed. Thucydides includes in his narrative a dispassionate and seemingly unbiased and fully accurate description of the plague. There are narrative elements in his recounting, which will be discussed later on, but his account seems almost clinical despite his lack of medical training. Thucydides himself is not unbiased, and it must be mentioned that he did suffer and subsequently recover from the plague. Diseases present differently in different people. Patients will often exhibit a similar suite of symptoms, but it is rare for any one patient to exhibit all associated symptoms for a disease, or for a disease to strike all patients in exactly the same way. Therefore, it would have been incredibly easy for Thucydides to overemphasize symptoms that he himself experienced and de-emphasize those that he did not. He is also only one observer, and as astute as he clearly is, his account is automatically biased by the limitations of his perspective. With these caveats in mind, he does give a thorough description to the extent that if the Athenian plague existed today as it did then, it seems reasonable that it could be diagnosed based on his accounting alone. There are narrative elements and biases to consider, but Thucydides is explicit and thorough enough that his description should not be in any way dismissed. He also mentions further that any animals which came into contact with the cadavers sickened and died, and that carrion birds quickly disappeared. He suggests that they also died. At first read, this is a nicely thorough description from which we can pick out symptoms. He explicitly describes fever and inflammation, congestion, a rash, vomiting, and diarrhea, and more implicitly suggests symptoms like intestinal distress, gangrene, and neurological disturbances. He also makes it clear whether or not he meant to, and it is more likely not, that this disease is zoonotic, but may be passed from human to human contact or via a very simple vector facilitated by human to human contact. The problem that has faced numerous scholars today, however, is that Thucydides' description does not match any known disease. Elements of it have been shown to resemble typhoid, typhus, smallpox, measles, and the bubonic plague, ergotism, and to Holiday and Poole's 1979 vast annoyance, scarlet fever. But none of these, nor any combination of these diseases or comorbidity, fully encapsulates Thucydides' account. But a prescient point made by the aforementioned authors is that it would be really strange if any of them did. The main thrust of Holiday and Poole's argument is that the Athenian plague occurred in 431 BCE, which is about 2.5 millennia ago. Pathogens, even when successful and adaptive, typically have very short lifespans and are reliant on their host for survival. Therefore, their rate of evolution is quite high, and they will typically evolve such that they will become less deadly, because if they kill their host, they themselves die. The host organism, in this case humans, simultaneously evolve or at least develop immunity such that the surviving population continues to survive the pathogen. The Athenian plague might have burnt itself out, causing it to go extinct, or it might have evolved into a much less deadly disease still extant today, but with a different or partial list of the above symptoms. It might have been something like smallpox or typhoid fever, but it might also have been something like varicella. Another point brought up briefly by several authors, but particularly relevant to the current pandemic, is that diseases do present differently in different people. Thucydides himself describes different progressions or perhaps complications for the Athenian plague. Likewise, victims of COVID-19 are sometimes entirely asymptomatic, or may experience only mild symptoms, or they may experience symptoms like fatigue and loss of smell, but not congestion, or they may develop pneumonia. Other symptoms like blood clotting leading to heart attack and stroke are rare but not uncommon and are not apparently demographically specific. This further complicates interpretation of Thucydides' narrative as a single historian trying to convey the symptoms of a feared disease in the midst of a cataclysmic war, followed by extreme political unrest, which at one point included his own banishment. He is ill-equipped to give an absolutely unbiased clinical accounting. Ultimately, Thucydides was not interested in the plague itself so much as the wider implications of the plague. I've described his account as thorough and nearly clinical, but he had commentary that his description of the plague is a part of. Structurally, it has been pointed out by Allison 1983 that the description of the plague is deliberately contrasted with Pericles' funeral oration just prior. In reading both the funeral oration and the description of the plague, it is necessary to remember that even if Thucydides were genuinely attempting a wholly accurate and unbiased account, he himself has admitted that especially his accounts of speeches given or arguments made were subject to the listener's memories. Furthermore, it is not entirely reasonable to surmise that his account is unbiased. Thucydides has points to make in reference to the plague, the political system of Athens, whether or not oligarchies are just, which leaders are and are not skilled, what factions of society he could do without, and so on and so forth. Allison points out that the contrast in language and the similar structure of the funeral oration and description of the plague to highlight how Thucydides is driving home a greater point about the breakdown of societal norms as he sees it. It does not undermine his description of the plague, but it does suggest that he could present a good accounting of the plague while making a wider sociopolitical argument. Analysis of the further subtext of Thucydides' account appears in Callett's 2013 paper. Callett challenges the tacitly accepted argument that Thucydides was atheistic in his writing. He is occasionally dismissive, particularly of oracles and prophecy, as we've seen in the previous presentation, but culturally it would be very difficult for Thucydides to dismiss the gods, even if he himself did not personally believe. After all, one of the charges leveled against Socrates, for which he was eventually executed, was atheism and also paradoxically worship of false gods. Furthermore, it is likely Thucydides did believe in the gods, and Callett argues that he considered the Athenian plague a sign of either Apollo's wrath at the Athenians or his favor towards the Spartans. It seems clear with his references, and it is historically rational, that Thucydides was writing for a Hellenistic audience more so than for posterity. So it's important to remember that this work is not for us. With that in mind, there are two particular aspects of his description of the plague that need to be revisited. These are the appearance of the plague, initially in Piraeus, and the doomed exposition of Hagnon. Thucydides tells us that the plague originated in Ethiopia, appeared in Lemnos, and eventually traveled to Piraeus, where it took hold and spread through the long walls to the polis. He mentions that because it appeared coincidentally at the same time the Peloponnesians did, and because Piraeus had reservoirs but not yet wells, that the suspicion grew up that the Spartans had poisoned the water supply. He then explains that this suspicion was discarded after the plague spread to Athens because the wells in the upper city are not fed from the same water source as the reservoirs in Piraeus. Following this, he gives his description of the plague, predicating the breakdown of societal norms. Other sources more firmly blame not Spartans, but non-Athenians or metics with the poisoning of the reservoirs and wells. One can easily draw a parallel between this accusation of the other poisoning water sources and the tendency towards the anti-Semitic trope of Jewish populations supposedly being responsible for the bubonic plague through similar methodologies. Thucydides is not overtly engaging in xenophobia, as he almost immediately dismisses the idea of that the water source was poisoned, but he does seem to be implicating trade routes or perhaps trade in general. This is a somewhat astute observation, given that trade routes and travel are responsible for many of the pandemics and epidemics and outbreaks that we have seen both in recent and distant history. COVID-19, part of the reason it became a pandemic was the failures in supporting and monitoring sick or exposed passengers on airlines and cruise ships, largely but not exclusively in the United States. And the first instance of the bubonic plague in Europe spread after Italian merchant ships escaped the siege of Kaffa. Incidentally, the water sources varied throughout Piraeus and Athens. Incidentally, that the water sources varied throughout Piraeus and Athens also means that the pathogen could not have been waterborne. This does not eliminate typhoid fever as a possible cause of the plague, but it does decrease its likelihood of being the culprit. Secondly, Thucydides tells of Hagnon's expedition to Thrace and Potidæa. Hagnon, according to Thucydides, had set out with 4,000 heavy infantry and proceeded to lose 1,050 of them over the course of about 40 days. Thucydides stresses that these soldiers had been previously healthy. In fact, this is a theme in his telling of the plague. From a modern perspective, this makes sense. One or several of the soldiers was pre-symptomatic before setting out, and because this pathogen can be passed from human to human and was apparently quite contagious, it spread through the army, killing a relatively large proportion. The overall death rate, if we can trust the reported numbers, is 26%, but it is not a case fatality rate because we don't know what proportion of the army was actually infected. However, for Thucydides to have fully inferred transmission of a pathogen from human contact would have been revolutionary at the time. And regardless of how well we regard him, it may be an overinterpretation to suggest that he was an ancient proponent of germ theory. At the time, the prevailing theory was that miasma, or bad air, caused the disease. In Attica, poor living conditions, particularly inside the long wall where overcrowding and unsanitary conditions were rife, did contribute to the spread of the plague and other diseases, but Thucydides seems to be making a very different point in his commentary on Hagnon's expedition. Calit argues that Thucydides understood the plague to be directed at anyone who wasn't in the Peloponnesian League, meaning Athenians and non-Athenians who lived in Athens or allied with her. Calit uses the choice of words to argue her point and is likely correct. But even if she is not correct regarding what Thucydides himself believed, the prevailing belief among the Delian League in general was that Apollo needed to be placated. Shrines that had fallen into disuse were restored, and the island of Delos, which I have put up a picture of on the PowerPoint, went through additional purifications. Thucydides, though, does not outright say that the plague is a result of Apollo's displeasure or alliance with the Lacedaemonians. Likely, that was considered too obvious to state. Instead, he relates the loss of confidence of the Athenian citizenry for Pericles and Pericles' apologia speech. Thucydides seems to hold Pericles in high regard, and his speech which largely calls on Athenians to borrow a phrase, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Thucydides says Pericles was largely successful in convincing the Athenians to redouble their efforts against the Lacedaemonians, but then he editorializes as follows. He told them to wait quietly, to pay attention to their marine, to attempt no new conquests, and to expose the city to no hazards during the war. And doing this promised them a favorable result. What they did was the very contrary, allowing private ambitions and private interests in matters apparently quite foreign to the war to lead them into projects unjust both to themselves and to their allies. Projects whose success would only conduce to the honor and advantage of private persons and whose failure entailed certain disaster on the country in the war. So this calls back to the previous presentation where the point of loyalty and selflessness was brought up. In Thucydides' estimation, the breakdown of society is complete. Just as with the plague, all people, regardless of age, rank, health, or wealth, were equally susceptible to moral and political decay. And thus, with the death of Pericles, Athens is narratively set on a path to disaster. Thucydides' account of the Athenian plague is often noted for its apocalyptic overtones. The author is heavy-handed in describing the breakdown of society during the plague, and while there is other evidence, historical and archaeological, to prove the reality of the narrative, Thucydides is clearly employing illness as a metaphor. He is, in fact, almost using Pericles himself as a metaphor. Thucydides may have been somewhat suspicious of democracy as a system of government, but what seems to motivate that suspicion is his experience with what he deems short-sighted, brash, or incompetent leaders. He holds Pericles, not democracy, as a he holds Pericles, not democracy, as a system of government in high esteem. Pericles' death with the plague is simple consequentialism, but Thucydides writes it as the beginning of the end for Athens. But this is not a fair rendering of the situation. Pericles does appear to have been an excellent statesman, but as with any democratic statesman, his fate was not inexorably tied to the states and vice versa. And of course, he was not perfect. Pericles made a good strategic decision in bringing the Athenian population behind the walls and sending the cattle to, I'm going to murder this pronunciation, Evia, there we are, Evia. Based on the information he had at the time, he expected the Lacedaemonians to raise the surrounding area and knew he could feed his population through the port at Piraeus. A naval blockade of the port was unlikely due to Athens' unparalleled naval strength. But while it is unlikely that Thucydides was the first proponent of germ theory, the understanding of illness at the time was that it was born on miasma or bad air. In crowding a large population into Athens' narrow long walls, Pericles had to know that unsanitary conditions would arise. Furthermore, prior to the siege, he had instituted xenophobic laws in a strong economy. This almost necessarily led to increased fear of the other during the siege. Disease, particularly widespread disease, always has political effect. The English sweating sickness drove Henry VIII into hiding and may have been the deciding factor in the Battle of Bosworth a generation prior. The waves of bubonic plague, which swept through Europe, altered the economy in the first instance and then permanently wrote itself into the design of cities. Smallpox wiped out entire populations during the colonization of the Americas, was even weaponized to do so. But as with this last example, infectious disease in humans tends to be more or less devastating as a result of extant sociopolitical climates. Thucydides uses the Athenian plague as a metaphor for societal decay, but if the shrines which were repaired during the plague are any indication, that decay was already in effect. We cannot draw exact parallels between any historical epidemic and our own current one. However, it is notable that those countries with more responsive leadership and good infrastructures have generally fared better than those countries with extremist political movements or unresponsive leaders. There has been in the past decade a steady rise in global fascism, which was in effect well before the pandemic. It would be no surprise to Thucydides that the countries hardest hit were also those with the strongest fascist movements, although he probably would have given a somewhat different explanation as to why. So here's my bibliography, and I just want to say thank you so much for listening, and a special thanks to Sasa and Digital Hammurabi for this chance to research outside of my usual area.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schulz. That was super interesting, especially interesting hearing from like a biological perspective, because we don't get that all that often when you're looking at ancient texts. I have a couple of questions here. One of them, are there any samples of ancient corpses from the time of the plague? Are there any clues?
Yeah, okay, so this actually bothered me quite a bit, because there definitely is. There is what I guess you could call a plague pit that has been found, and it's basically the grave goods are such that it was very clear that people were very concerned about handling these corpses and spending too much time around them. And so that was submitted to an ancient DNA study where they did try to figure out what this pathogen might be. And I really disagree with their conclusion, because what they did with that, unfortunately, is they only tested for certain diseases that we know about today. And they came to the conclusion that it was typhoid. And the thing is, the ancient Greeks definitely knew what typhoid was. And I'm pretty sure that if Thucydides saw that Athens was suffering from typhoid, he would have said Athens is suffering from typhoid. So it's unlikely that that's really a proper, I think what happened is there were some bodies that had survived typhoid before succumbing to the Athenian plague. And that's where it picked up on the ADNA study. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
I think that was a good answer. It kind of makes me wonder, although this is well outside of my area, it makes me think of the fact that coronaviruses are very common, but COVID looks different, at least from my uneducated perspective. The symptoms look rather different from, the common cold, for example. So I wonder if it could be like a strange, is it possible that it's like a strange variant form of it or something?
Absolutely.
Like
Yeah, it totally is. Like my headcanon for this particular disease is that it's hemorrhagic smallpox, and that's based largely on the CFR. But of course, like as I said, we don't actually know the CFR. So this is me just speculating. It's probably not based on any reality. I don't want to say too much about COVID-19 because I'm not an epidemiologist either, but yeah, it is it is obviously related to coronavirus, but its effect, like you don't usually get a cold and also have a stroke at 30. That's not normal. So this could have been something like measles. And in fact, measles is one of the big arguments made by a lot of authors. And then just later, measles got a little bit less horrible, or it could have been measles that existed. And then in this one instant, it was really, really bad and then burned itself out. And that particular strain disappeared. So.
makes sense. So great answers. I have a question here that's not so much a Q&A type question, but someone asked for links to your work and reading on the Peloponnesian War. This is timely. 3 exclamation points.
Oh, okay.
So do you want to give people links to your work?
I don't have anything published on this currently. I am hoping to write something soon. You can check out my Medium page. That's just under my name. As for links, if you can just put up my, or as for more information, you can put up my bibliography again. Did I stop sharing, or is it visible currently?
I stopped your sharing because the people demanded that you be full screened for the Q&A.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. If we could share my bibliography, that might be interesting. There's a few pieces in The Guardian, I know, in opinion pieces on the Athenian Plague and its connection to COVID-19 specifically, if that helps.
It does, yeah, and that will go up. People can rewind a little bit to find it, or it will go up when when these things get published. I'll put the link to your Medium page in the YouTube chat.
Okay, great. I don't know that there's going to be a lot right now about it, but in the future there definitely will be.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting stuff. Thank you so much, Dr. Schulz.